Captain Sarah adjusted her tactical gear one final time as the helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air above the Afghan mountains. The intelligence briefing had been clear but unsettling. A remote valley settlement had gone dark 3 days ago, and satellite imagery showed unusual movement patterns around the area. What should have been a simple reconnaissance mission was about to become something far more dangerous. The settlement of Village sat nestled between two steep mountain ridges, home to roughly 200 civilians who had managed to maintain neutrality throughout years of conflict. The village elder had been a valuable source of intelligence for coalition forces, providing information about insurgent movements through the mountain passes. His sudden silence had triggered immediate concern at the forward operating base. Sarah had earned her reputation as one of the most skilled marksmen in her unit through 3 tours of duty. Her ability to remain calm under extreme pressure and make impossible shots had saved countless lives. At 28, she had already been awarded 2 Bronze Stars and a Silver Star for her actions in previous engagements. Her commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Martinez, had specifically requested her for this mission. The helicopter touched down on a rocky outcrop approximately 3 kilometers from the village. Sarah's spotter, Sergeant Mike, had worked with her for over 2 years. Their partnership had become legendary within their unit, with its ability to read wind patterns and environmental conditions perfectly complementing Sarah's shooting skills. Together, they had completed over 40 successful missions without losing a single friendly casualty. As they moved through the rocky terrain toward their observation point, Sarah noticed signs that made her increasingly uneasy. Animal tracks showed creatures fleeing the area, and the usual sounds of mountain wildlife were conspicuously absent. The silence felt unnatural, as if the entire mountain was holding its breath. Set up their observation equipment on a ridge that provided clear sight lines to the village below. Through her high-powered scope, Sarah could see that something was very wrong. No smoke rose from cooking fires, no children played in the central courtyard, and no adults moved about their daily routines. The village appeared completely abandoned, yet fresh tire tracks and footprints suggested recent activity. Their radio crackled with an update from base command. Drone surveillance had detected multiple armed individuals moving through the area, but the exact number and their intentions remained unclear. The mission parameters were simple: observe, report, and engage only if civilian lives were in immediate danger. As the hours passed, the true scope of the situation began to reveal itself. Through careful observation, Sarah identified at least 15 armed militants who had clearly taken control of the village. The civilians were being held in the central mosque, with guards posted at every entrance. The militants had set up defensive positions throughout the village, creating a fortress-like environment that would be nearly impossible to assault directly. Sarah's training kicked in as she began calculating distances, wind speeds, and potential shooting angles. The village was positioned 1,200 meters from their current location, right at the edge of her effective range with the specialized rifle she carried. Every shot would need to be perfect, as the sound of gunfire would immediately alert the remaining militants to their presence. As afternoon shadows grew longer, the situation became more desperate. Through intercepted radio communications, they learned that the militants planned to execute the village elder at sunset as an example to other communities that had cooperated with coalition forces. Time was running out, and no additional support would arrive before the deadline. Methodically recorded environmental conditions, while Sarah studied the militant positions through her scope. The enemy had chosen their defensive positions well, using the village's natural layout to create overlapping fields of fire. Any conventional assault would result in heavy casualties among both the attacking forces and the civilian hostages. The weight of responsibility settled on Sarah's shoulders as she realized that she and were the only hope for the 200 innocent people trapped below. Her rifle, a specially modified system capable of precision shots at extreme distances, would be their primary weapon against an enemy force that outnumbered them significantly. As the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, Sarah made the decision that would define the next several hours of her life. She would engage the militants one by one, using stealth and precision to eliminate the threat while minimizing risk to the civilians. Confirmed the plan and began preparing for what would become one of the most challenging sniper engagements in modern military history. The stage was set for a confrontation that would test every skill Sarah had developed throughout her military career. Sarah controlled her breathing as she settled into her firing position behind the specialized rifle. The weapon system, a .338 Magnum with custom modifications, had been her companion through countless missions. Lay beside her, his spotting scope trained on the village below while his fingers worked quickly across the ballistic calculator that would determine the precise adjustments needed for each shot. The distance to target was confirmed at exactly 1,247 meters. At this range, even the slightest miscalculation would result in a complete miss. The afternoon mountain winds created additional challenges, with crosswinds varying between 8 and 12 miles per hour depending on the terrain features below. Called out the environmental readings in a steady, calm voice that belied the tension of their situation. Through her scope, Sarah could see the militants had organized themselves into a defensive perimeter around the village. 2 guards stood at the main entrance, positioned behind makeshift barriers constructed from village furniture and farming equipment. Additional sentries patrolled the rooftops of several buildings, while others had taken positions in windows that provided commanding views of the surrounding approaches. The militants appeared to be a mix of local insurgents and foreign fighters, based on their varied equipment and clothing. Some carried modern assault rifles, while others were armed with older weapons that had seen decades of conflict. Their discipline varied considerably, with some maintaining proper tactical awareness while others appeared overconfident and careless. Sarah identified her first target, a militant positioned on the roof of the village's tallest building who was using binoculars to scan the surrounding mountains. His elevated position and surveillance equipment made him the most dangerous immediate threat to their concealment. If he spotted their muzzle flash or movement, the entire mission would be compromised within seconds. Calculated the shooting solution, accounting for the bullet's trajectory over the extreme distance, the effects of altitude on air density, and the constantly shifting wind patterns. The bullet would travel for over 2 seconds before reaching its target, during which time environmental conditions could change significantly. Sarah would need to time her shot perfectly to account for the target's movement patterns. She centered the crosshairs on the militant's chest, leading him slightly to account for his slow patrol movement along the rooftop. Her finger found the trigger as she completed her breathing cycle, holding at the natural respiratory pause that all precision shooters learn to recognize. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the mountain valley. The .338 caliber bullet traveled its prescribed path through the thin mountain air, maintaining supersonic velocity throughout its flight. Sarah watched through her scope as the militant suddenly stiffened and collapsed backward, his binoculars clattering to the rooftop below. The other militants continued their routines, unaware that their surveillance capability had just been eliminated. Was already calculating the next shot as Sarah cycled the bolt action, chambering a fresh round. Their second target was a militant positioned near the mosque entrance who carried what appeared to be a radio communication device. Eliminating him would disrupt the enemy's ability to coordinate their response and call for reinforcements from other militant cells in the region. This shot presented additional challenges due to the target's position partially concealed behind a stone wall. Only his upper torso was visible, creating a smaller target area at the extreme range. Sarah would need to thread the bullet through a narrow window of opportunity when the militant moved into the open space near the mosque entrance. The target emerged from cover as expected, his radio held to his ear as he spoke with someone outside the village. Sarah's crosshairs tracked his movement, and she fired when he paused in the doorway. The bullet struck with devastating effect, and the militant collapsed instantly. His radio skittered across the courtyard stones, its antenna broken and the device rendered useless. Still, the remaining militants showed no signs of alarm. The distance was so great that the sound of Sarah's rifle fire took several seconds to reach the village, and by then it was difficult to determine the direction from which the shots had originated. The natural echo effects created by the mountain terrain further confused any attempts to locate the source of the gunfire. Spotted their third target, a militant who had been stationed as a roving patrol around the village perimeter. This fighter carried an RPG launcher along with his assault rifle, making him a significant threat to any potential rescue operation. His patrol route took him along a predictable path that would provide Sarah with a clear shot opportunity every 4 minutes. Sarah waited patiently for the militant to complete his circuit and arrive at the predetermined shooting position. The target appeared exactly where had predicted, pausing to light a cigarette before continuing his patrol. This moment of stillness provided the perfect opportunity for a precision shot at maximum range. The bullet found its mark with lethal accuracy, and the militant fell forward into a drainage ditch beside the village path. His RPG launcher tumbled into the muddy water, eliminating a major threat to the civilian hostages and any future rescue attempts. The cigarette continued to burn in the dirt beside his motionless form. By this point, some of the remaining militants had begun to sense that something was wrong. 3 of their comrades had disappeared from their posts, but the extreme distance and environmental conditions made it nearly impossible for them to understand what was happening. Several militants began moving more cautiously, staying closer to cover and scanning the surrounding mountains with increasing concern. Sarah knew they had achieved tactical surprise, but that advantage would not last much longer. The enemy would soon realize they were under attack and would likely begin executing hostages if they felt threatened. The pressure was mounting to eliminate as many threats as possible before their presence was discovered, and the situation escalated beyond their control. The afternoon sun was beginning its descent behind the western peaks when the militants finally realized they were under attack. Sarah watched through her scope as a fighter emerged from one of the houses and began shouting to his companions, pointing toward the areas where their missing comrades should have been positioned. The element of surprise was rapidly disappearing. Continued his steady stream of calculations and environmental updates, but his voice now carried an edge of urgency. They had successfully eliminated 8 militants without detection, but the remaining fighters were becoming increasingly alert and paranoid. Several had taken defensive positions that made clean shots nearly impossible, while others had moved closer to the mosque where the civilians were being held. Sarah's next target presented the most challenging shot yet attempted. A militant leader, distinguishable by his more sophisticated equipment and the deference shown by other fighters, had positioned himself in a second-story window that provided only a narrow angle of exposure. The shot would need to thread between wooden shutters while accounting for the bullet's drop over the extreme distance. The leader appeared to be organizing a systematic search of the village perimeter and the surrounding areas. Through intercepted radio transmissions, confirmed that the militant was attempting to contact other cells for reinforcement. If he succeeded in establishing communication with external support, the situation would become impossible to resolve with only 2 operators. Sarah steadied her breathing and centered the crosshairs on the barely visible target. The militant's position behind the window frame left only a 6-inch window of opportunity, requiring absolute precision at maximum range. She waited for the perfect moment when the target moved into the narrow opening, then squeezed the trigger with practiced control. The bullet shattered the wooden shutter and struck the militant leader in the center of his chest, sending him tumbling backward into the room. His radio clattered across the floor, the transmission cutting to static. The psychological impact on the remaining fighters was immediate and devastating, as they realized their leader had been eliminated by an unseen enemy. Panic began to spread among the surviving militants as they struggled to understand the nature of the threat they faced. Some took cover in buildings, while others moved erratically around the village, making themselves easier targets for Sarah's precision fire. The lack of coordination and leadership was working to her advantage, but it also made the situation more unpredictable and dangerous for the hostages. Identified several militants who were moving toward the mosque, apparently intending to use the civilians as human shields. This development transformed the tactical situation into a race against time. Sarah would need to eliminate these threats before they could reach the hostages, but the militants were using buildings and terrain features to mask their approach. Sarah's 10th target was a fighter who was attempting to reach the mosque by moving along a covered walkway between buildings. Only his legs were visible beneath the wooden overhang, creating an extremely difficult target at the 1,200-meter distance. The shot required precise timing and unconventional aiming to disable the threat without causing a fatal wound that might trigger immediate retaliation against civilians. She aimed for the militant's knee joint, intending to immobilize rather than kill. The bullet struck exactly as planned, shattering the target's leg and dropping him in the walkway where he could no longer threaten the hostages. His screams of pain added to the confusion and fear among the remaining fighters. The wounded militant's cries had an unexpected effect on his companions. Rather than rushing to assist him, several fighters abandoned their positions and retreated to more defensible locations deeper in the village. The psychological warfare aspect of Sarah's precision shooting was proving as effective as the physical elimination of threats. Spotted movement in the mosque area that caused immediate concern. Two militants had reached the building and were positioning themselves near the main entrance where the civilians were being held. If these fighters decided to harm the hostages out of desperation or revenge, the entire rescue mission would become a failure despite the tactical success achieved so far. Sarah's next shot would be the most critical of the engagement. The target was partially concealed behind the mosque's stone doorframe, with only his shoulder and part of his head visible. The angle was severe, and the distance remained at the absolute limit of her weapon's effective range. Missing this shot could result in immediate harm to innocent civilians. The militant appeared to be arguing with someone inside the mosque, gesturing angrily with his weapon. Sarah could see the fear and desperation in his body language as he struggled to understand how his unit was being systematically eliminated. This emotional state made him unpredictable and extremely dangerous to the hostages under his control. Provided the final calculations for what would be the most important shot of Sarah's military career. The environmental conditions had shifted as afternoon shadows lengthened, creating thermal currents that could affect the bullet's trajectory. Wind patterns had become more complex as mountain temperatures began to drop with the approaching sunset. Sarah centered her crosshairs on the visible portion of the militant's head, accounting for the steep downward angle and the challenging environmental conditions. She controlled her breathing, found her natural respiratory pause, and applied steady pressure to the trigger. The rifle fired, and the bullet began its 2-second journey toward a target that held the lives of 200 innocent people in his hands. The shot was perfect, striking the militant in the head and eliminating the immediate threat to the hostages. His companion inside the mosque emerged to investigate the sound, exposing himself to Sarah's follow-up shot that dropped him in the courtyard. The main threat to the civilian population had been neutralized, but several militants remained scattered throughout the village. With the immediate threat to the hostages eliminated, Sarah faced a new challenge. The remaining militants had finally determined the general direction from which the shots were originating. Through her scope, she could see fighters positioning themselves behind cover while scanning the mountain ridges with whatever optical equipment they possessed. The advantage of complete surprise was gone, replaced by a deadly game of hide and seek across the 1,200-meter gap. Monitored radio communications and reported that the surviving militants were attempting to establish contact with reinforcements from neighboring valleys. If they succeeded in calling for support, helicopter gunships or additional ground forces could arrive within hours, transforming Sarah's tactical victory into a strategic disaster. The mission timeline had become critical. Sarah counted at least 12 militants still active within the village perimeter. Their movements had become more coordinated as a new leader emerged from their ranks, a fighter who demonstrated better tactical awareness than his predecessors. This individual was organizing the remaining forces into defensive positions that maximized cover while maintaining fields of fire toward the suspected sniper locations. The new militant leader had made a crucial tactical decision that complicated Sarah's mission significantly. Rather than continuing to patrol in the open, he ordered his fighters to remain under cover and wait for darkness. Mountain combat favored defenders who knew the terrain, and nightfall would neutralize much of Sarah's long-range advantage while allowing the militants to move freely under cover of darkness. Sarah realized she had perhaps 30 minutes of useful daylight remaining. The setting sun was creating challenging lighting conditions that affected her scope's clarity, while lengthening shadows provided additional concealment opportunities for the enemy forces. Every shot would need to count as environmental conditions deteriorated and time pressure mounted. Identified a militant who was attempting to reach a radio equipment cache stored in one of the village buildings. If this fighter succeeded in establishing external communication, reinforcements would certainly arrive before Sarah and could extract safely. The target was moving carefully from building to building, using doorways and windows to minimize exposure. Sarah tracked the militant's movement pattern, predicting where he would next appear based on the building layout and logical routes to his objective. She prepositioned her crosshairs at a narrow gap between structures where the target would be forced to cross open ground. When the fighter appeared exactly as anticipated, her shot was ready. The bullet caught the militant in mid-stride as he attempted to dash between buildings. His momentum carried him forward into the dirt courtyard, where his weapon clattered away across the stone pavement. The radio equipment remained tantalizingly close to his position, but no other fighter was willing to risk the exposure necessary to retrieve it. The psychological pressure on the remaining militants was becoming evident through their increasingly erratic behavior. Some fighters were firing randomly toward the mountains, wasting ammunition while revealing their positions. Others remained frozen in defensive positions, too frightened to move but unable to contribute meaningfully to their unit's survival. Sarah's 15th target was a militant who had taken position in a grain storage building with a clear view of the mosque courtyard. This fighter represented a continuing threat to any civilian movement and needed to be eliminated before the hostages could be safely evacuated. The building's small windows provided only brief exposure opportunities as the target moved around inside. The shot required patience and timing as Sarah waited for the militant to appear at one of the windows. When he finally exposed himself to scan the surrounding area, her bullet shattered the wooden window frame and eliminated the threat. Splinters of wood scattered across the building's interior as the fighter collapsed among the stored grain sacks. Reported movement near the village's secondary exit, where several militants appeared to be preparing for an escape attempt. These fighters had gathered weapons and equipment, suggesting they planned to abandon the village and potentially take hostages with them. Sarah would need to intercept this group before they could disappear into the mountain wilderness. The escape group consisted of 4 militants moving in tactical formation toward the village outskirts. Their leader was the same fighter who had assumed command after the original leader's elimination, demonstrating that he possessed significant military training and experience. This made him both a priority target and a particularly challenging opponent. Sarah's shot at the group leader required a difficult angle through vegetation that partially obscured her target. The bullet needed to penetrate light brush cover while maintaining accuracy over the extreme distance. She aimed for center mass, accounting for the possibility that vegetation might deflect the bullet slightly from its intended path. The shot was successful, striking the leader in the chest and dropping him among the mountain scrub. His 3 companions immediately sought cover, abandoning their escape attempt in favor of defensive positions among the rocks and sparse vegetation outside the village proper. The group's cohesion disintegrated without effective leadership. As the sun touched the western horizon, Sarah faced a critical decision. She could continue engaging individual targets as opportunities presented themselves, potentially eliminating all remaining threats given enough time and ammunition. Alternatively, she could shift to a support role for the civilian evacuation while maintaining overwatch against any remaining militants who might threaten the rescue operation. The choice was made for her when spotted movement in the mosque courtyard. Village elder emerged from the building, followed by a stream of women, children, and elderly civilians who had been held hostage throughout the engagement. The sight of innocent people moving freely in the open transformed Sarah's priorities from offensive operations to protective overwatch. Several militants remained hidden throughout the village, but their will to fight appeared broken. The systematic elimination of over half their force by an invisible enemy had shattered their morale and tactical coherence. Most of the survivors seemed focused on personal survival rather than continuing their mission against the civilian population. Sarah maintained her position and scanning pattern, ready to engage any threat that emerged against the evacuating civilians. Coordinated with base command to arrange helicopter extraction for the hostages while monitoring for any signs of reinforcement approaching the area. The most dangerous phase of the mission was beginning as vulnerable civilians moved through terrain that might still contain hostile forces. The evacuation of village proceeded under Sarah's protective overwatch as helicopter rotors echoed across the valley. 2 A-60 Black Hawks approached from the south, maintaining low-altitude flight paths that kept them below the surrounding mountain peaks. The pilots had been briefed on the tactical situation and understood that hostile forces might still be present in the area. Sarah maintained her position behind the rifle scope, scanning methodically for any remaining threats as nearly 200 civilians moved toward the designated landing zones. The elderly village elder had organized the evacuation with remarkable efficiency despite the trauma of 3 days in captivity. Children stayed close to their parents while adults carried essential belongings and assisted those who needed help moving across the rough terrain. Monitored multiple radio frequencies, coordinating between the evacuation helicopters Base Command, and Sarah's ongoing Overwatch mission. Intelligence reports indicated that no reinforcements were approaching the area, but several militants remained unaccounted for within the village perimeter. The potential for a final desperate attack against the evacuating civilians remained a serious concern. Through her scope, Sarah spotted movement in one of the abandoned buildings where a militant had taken refuge during the earlier engagement. The fighter appeared to be positioning himself for a shot against the evacuation area, carrying what looked like a scoped rifle of his own. This represented the most serious remaining threat to the civilian population and the helicopter crews. The range to this new target was approximately 1,300 meters, pushing beyond the normal effective range of Sarah's weapon system. Environmental conditions had deteriorated as mountain winds increased with the approaching sunset, adding complexity to an already challenging shot. Quickly calculated the ballistic solution while Sarah adjusted her position for the best possible angle. The militant was moving carefully within the building, using window frames and doorways to minimize his exposure while maintaining a clear field of fire toward the landing zones. Sarah would have only seconds when he positioned himself for his own shot, requiring perfect timing and execution to prevent potential casualties among the evacuating civilians. When the target finally appeared at a second-story window with his rifle raised, Sarah was ready. Her shot traveled the extended distance and struck the militant in the upper chest, sending him tumbling backward into the building's interior. His rifle fell from the window and clattered on the stones below, eliminating the final significant threat to the evacuation operation. The first helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and rotor wash, immediately beginning to load women, children, and elderly villagers. The aircraft's door gunners maintained defensive positions while keeping watch for any hostile movement in the surrounding area. The pilots worked with practiced efficiency, knowing that time on the ground increased vulnerability to enemy action. Sarah continued her overwatch as the second helicopter approached its landing zone. Her ammunition count was running low after the extended engagement, but sufficient rounds remained to address any final threats that might emerge. Packed their equipment in preparation for their own extraction, which would occur after all civilians had been safely evacuated from the area. Village Elder approached the helicopter landing zones carrying important intelligence documents that he had managed to conceal throughout his captivity. These papers contained information about militant movements and supply routes that would prove invaluable to ongoing coalition operations in the region. His cooperation and bravery during the crisis had prevented the loss of critical intelligence assets. As the first helicopter lifted off with its load of evacuated civilians, Sarah noticed movement among the rocks outside the village perimeter. Two militants who had escaped during the earlier fighting were attempting to position themselves for an attack against the remaining helicopter. Their movements were desperate and poorly coordinated, suggesting they understood this would likely be their final opportunity to inflict casualties. Sarah's shots at these fleeting targets required rapid target acquisition and firing at maximum range against moving opponents using natural cover. The first militant fell among the rocks after being struck center mass, while his companion immediately sought better concealment, tracked the second fighter's movement, and provided guidance for Sarah's follow-up shot. The final militant emerged from cover in a last desperate attempt to reach firing position against the helicopter. Sarah's bullet found its mark, eliminating the threat just as the second aircraft completed loading the remaining civilians and prepared for takeoff. The immediate danger to the evacuation operation had been neutralized through precision fire at extreme range. With all civilians safely airborne and heading toward the coalition base, Sarah, and prepared for their own extraction, a specialized operations helicopter approached their position, flying a nap-of-the-earth profile that kept it concealed from any remaining hostile observation. The crew had been briefed on the sniper team's critical role in the successful rescue operation. Sarah carefully secured her weapon system while gathered their observation and communication equipment. Their mission had resulted in the elimination of over 30 hostile fighters while enabling the safe evacuation of 200 innocent civilians. No friendly casualties had been sustained during the operation, and valuable intelligence assets had been preserved for future operations. The extraction helicopter touched down on their ridge position as the last light faded from the western sky. Sarah moved quickly to the aircraft, carrying their equipment and the detailed intelligence they had gathered during the extended observation period. The pilot immediately lifted off and headed toward base, maintaining low altitude to avoid potential surface-to-air threats. As they flew over village one final time, Sarah could see that the area was quiet and apparently empty of hostile activity. The precision engagement had broken the militant force and eliminated their capability to threaten the local population. The village would eventually be resettled by its original inhabitants once coalition forces had thoroughly cleared the area and established security. The mission debrief at the forward operating base confirmed that Sarah's actions had prevented a potential massacre while preserving critical intelligence relationships in the region. Her precision shooting at extreme range had neutralized a numerically superior enemy force without risking civilian casualties or requiring a large-scale military operation that could have resulted in significant collateral damage.